Okay, the determinant, and that's what we've been talking about just a minute ago. We were talking about that determinant. It is the denominator of that number that we use to come up with the inverse. But there is a determinant, and to find the determinant, we just talked about this. We multiply those, and we multiply those, and we subtract the two numbers. So another thing to pay attention to on this page is here we have the notation. And again, we saw that on the other page. It kind of looks like the absolute value, but we are talking about matrices, so we have to take our context clues. Since we're talking about matrices, this is actually the determinant, not an absolute value. Okay, so we just did these a minute ago on the other side. So let me remind you that the determinant is 2 times 4 minus 5 times 1. So that's 8 minus 5. And that is an answer of 3. Will you take a second and try number 2 and see how you do with that? Okay, so you should have come up with negative 51 because it's negative 6 times 9 minus negative 3 times 1. And so we get negative 54 plus 3 because negative is plus, and that gives us negative 51. That is our determinant. And once again, the notation for that is this absolute value looking thing. I didn't call these, but if for instance, if this was matrix C, then I would say that the determinant of C is negative 51. All right, well, I alluded to this earlier, but we don't have to do this all by hand because it would take forever, right? The 2 by 2s we can do. We just did a couple of them, but it kind of takes a while. 3 by 3s, they start to get even more complex, 4 by 4s, etc. So our calculator can do this for us. We don't have to do this ourselves. So get out your graphing calculator, pause the video here, find your calculator because we're going to go through this and you're going to need to know how to do this. These are going to be steps that you need to memorize. All right, we are here at a blank screen and our instructions say to find the inverse of a matrix using your graphing calculator, go to second matrix edit. All right, let me show you where that is. The second button, you know where that is. The matrix button is right here above the x to the negative 1 button, that inverse button. So we're going to hit that and we get a whole menu for matrices. Now, if you have never used matrices before, your list right now is probably blank. It just says A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, and then forever. But if you have borrowed a calculator, you might have old matrices in there. I'm sure there's a way to clear out all the old matrices, but it's a lot easier just to write over on top of the old matrices. So don't worry if you have old things listed. You can see this. I've got 3 of them here, or 4 of them here, and I'm just going to write over them when I need them. Okay, so now after we go here, we want to go over to Edit. So we'll arrow over to Edit, and we want to choose the top one, just matrix A. Now, sometimes when you choose these, you might want to write down in the margins which one you're doing so that you know which one you have. But this is going to be, for me, I'm going to use matrix A. I'm going to hit Enter. Now, right now it says it's a 3 by 3, but the matrix on our paper is actually only a 2 by 2. So I need to change this, and so I'm going to type in 2, Enter, 2, Enter. And now it has shrunk down my matrix, so I only have a 2 by 2 instead of the 3 by 3. Okay, I now need to type in my matrix, so I'm just going to type it in. 4, Enter, negative 3, Enter, 7, Enter, 2. So now I have my matrix. This is matrix A. If you look at your paper instructions again, it says now go to second quit. So we're going to quit out of here, and we're back to a blank screen. To find the inverse, we need to pull up the letter. So we're going to go to second, matrix, and it says names. That means you just want to type in the name of the matrix. I'm going to hit enter for names. So I have an A, matrix A, on my screen. Now, the next step, step 4, says to hit the x to the negative 1 button. That's the inverse button. That's right here kind of by the 7 a little bit. I'm going to hit that, and I get a to the negative first power, which means the inverse of a, and I just hit enter, and I get this matrix. Okay, also on your paper, this is a step that some of you really like. It says to convert from fractions to decimals, go to math, enter, enter. So let's try that. If we go to math, and it says to fraction, enter, enter, it changes our matrix into a fraction. Now, when you're doing these on a test or a homework or whatever, sometimes I might just say round to the 3 decimal places. Or you can always change it to a fraction if you want to. So that's how you change a decimal to a fraction. So let's go ahead and write that down on our paper. Okay, remember I said I labeled this one A, so I'm going to put a note there to myself that this is A. And then A to the negative first, that means the inverse of A. And so I'm going to enter these values, 2 over 29, 3 over 29, negative 7 over 29, and 4 over 29. So that is the inverse of matrix A. What that means is, and why this is helpful, is if I multiplied matrix A times the inverse of matrix A, I would get the identity matrix. That is the matrix, the identity matrix for a 2 by 2 would look like this. Okay, that was for a 2 by 2. And like I said, maybe you could do that by hand faster than you could a calculator. But let's go to a 3 by 3. I'm going to call this matrix B. I'm going to write that down so that I remember when I'm in my calculator what letter I used. So I'm going to go to matrix B. So let's go back to our calculator, follow those instructions, go to second matrix edit. So I'm here, I'm going to go to second matrix edit. Now in the edit menu, I said a minute ago that I was going to call it B. So I'm going to go down to B and I'm going to choose B. And once again, mine already has a 3 by 3. Yours might be different. You might need to enter 3 by 3. So you just go 3, enter, 3, enter, and now you're into the matrix itself. And so I'm going to go row by row. I'm going to type in 1, 2, 3, and negative 2, 6, negative 1, and 4, 1, 9. So that's my matrix B. Now remember how to find the inverse of it. We're going to quit this menu. And this is kind of junky, so I want to clear that off. You don't have to, but just if it's distracting to you, you might clear it off. Okay, so now I want second matrix name, but I want to come down and choose B. That's what I'm dealing with now, so I choose B. I need the inverse of B, so I use this negative 1 power. That gives me the inverse. I'm going to hit enter. And this time it is decimals, but they're still rational numbers. They don't go on forever. For instance, 2.8 isn't rounded. It's just plain old 2.8. So you know what? I think I can write that down without having to change that to a fraction. I'm okay with that because you're not truncating or rounding. It just is what it is. So let's go ahead and write that down on our paper. Okay, so the inverse of B is 11, negative 3, negative 4, 2.8, negative 6, negative 1, negative 5.2, 1.4, and 2. Okay, so all this begs the question, we've been spending a lot of time on this, why do we even care? Why do we need inverse matrices? Well, the reason we need inverse matrices is to solve equations. Here's the deal, you can't divide matrices, but you can multiply by the inverse. All right, so if this was a normal equation, like if this was 8x equals 48, we would just divide by 8 and divide by 8. But you can't do that with matrices. You can't divide matrices. But what you can do is you can multiply by the inverse. So in other words, I could take this times 1/8, and I could take this times 1/8, and then I would get the answer for the matrix, which is the same as integers. It's just we have matrices instead. Remember, with matrices, order does matter, so that's going to come into play as well. Okay, once again, we're going to turn the page here in just a second. Before we turn the page, do you have questions? Write any questions down in the margin so that we can talk about those in class tomorrow.